Okay, let me go ahead and get started. I know that there still will be a few more people that will join us, but I recognize that everyone is on a schedule, and we really appreciate all of you being able to attend this press conference this afternoon. My name is John Yang. I am the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and we are excited to announce the launch of an anti-racial profiling project here at Advancing Justice, AAJC, that is focused on the targeting of Chinese American scientists and academics. Before I talk too much about this project, I am very happy to introduce a number of speakers that we will have that will tell you about the environment under which we have been launching this project and some of the issues that we are seeing. We are privileged to have with us Congresswoman Judy Chu from the 27th District of California, Dr. Xiaoxing Xi, the Laura H. Carnell Professor of Physics at Temple University, Professor Frank Wu, who is President of Queens College, Dr. Stephen Pei, a physicist, Professor of Electrical Engineering, and the founding chairman of United Chinese Americans, and Regina G Caldwell, a board member and past chapter president for OCA Greater Houston area. So let me tell you just very briefly about my organization, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Advancing Justice, AAJC's mission is to advance the civil rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. So we work towards that by trying to, among other things, eliminate discrimination in all its forms, including with respect to Asian Americans. So we're very excited to launch this program and to have this press briefing to talk about it. So to lead us off, we will have Representative Congresswoman Judy Chu, who is also the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Representative Chu will talk a little bit about the environment in which this profiling of Asian American scientists and academics is being encountered, and also her perspective from as a member of Congress. Unfortunately, she will have to leave us shortly after her remarks. After all of our speakers, we will have an opportunity for question and answer. Please do not hesitate to use the chat box for the questions and answers. So it's my pleasure to introduce Representative Judy Chu, who represents, among other things, the San Gabriel Valley and Pasadena area, and has been a fierce advocate for our entire Asian American community. Representative Chu. And you are on mute right now, unfortunately. Still on mute. Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu, and as a chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call CAPAC, I want to thank Asian Americans Advancing Justice for launching your anti-racial profiling project and inviting me to speak today. Even before the coronavirus pandemic began and we saw the rise of racial slurs like China virus and Kung flu, which have contributed to over 2,600 anti-Asian hate incidents, the Asian American community had already been put at risk by a rising tide of anti-China rhetoric that's continued to worsen each year. I want to be clear why we should absolutely acknowledge our differences with the policies of the Chinese Communist Party. We should not blanketly target all Chinese people and promote China bashing that puts Asian American lives at risk. Unfortunately, we've seen how anti-China sentiment has become more prevalent under the Trump administration, especially as Donald Trump and his followers continue to blame China for the coronavirus pandemic. In fact, after Donald Trump announced that he and the First Lady had coronavirus, we saw a flood of ugly backlash and conspiracy theories online saying that China gave Trump the coronavirus to kill him and that they must be held accountable. And there is a real worry that this will lead to more hate and violence against the Asian American community. So the launching of this project could not come at a better time. One of the most dire impacts of this increased anti-China rhetoric has been an increase not only in hate crimes against Asian Americans, but also the racial profiling of students, researchers, engineers, scientists, and even federal employees who've been wrongly accused of being spies for China simply because of the way they look. For instance, Temple University Professor Xiaoxing Xi and our hydrologist Sherry Chen were both falsely accused by the FBI being spies for China, only to have their charges dropped without any explanation. They faced humiliating arrests and had their entire lives turned upside down as a result of these false accusations, and they're still seeking justice. But they're not alone. We've heard stories of Asian American professors and scientists who are being caught up in similar situations at research institutions and on university campuses all across the nation. In fact, just last month, the Department of Justice dropped yet another case against a visiting Chinese scientist at the University of Virginia after wrongly accusing him of illegally accessing university materials, even though this information was included in a shared space that he had authorized access to. And under the Trump administration, we've seen more and more Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans fear that they will be the victim of racial profiling as tensions between the United States and China continue to rise. These cases have had a chilling effect on our community. I've heard from so many individuals who are afraid of pursuing a career in science or academia because they fear being falsely accused of spying and worry that they may be racially profiled simply because they are Chinese. This is not right. That is why it is so important we are doing everything we can to ensure our nation's leaders and intelligence community do not perpetuate harmful Cold War rhetoric with China. That is why I have been proactive, helping to set up meetings between Asian American leaders and leaders in the intelligence community to ensure that our nation's policies do not promote blanket racial profiling. Earlier this summer, I also sent a hate crimes toolkit and messaging guidance to every member of Congress, urging them to avoid using Cold War-style rhetoric around China and stoking xenophobia that puts Asian Americans at risk. And earlier this year, Congressmember Jamie Raskin and I put out a letter to the FBI as well as to the National Institute of Health demanding documents on the profiling of Chinese scientists and engineers. With Jamie Raskin being on the House Oversight Committee, we expect answers and we will continue to press until we have answers into our official investigation. So let me say, AAJC has been such a critical partner on these issues, and that's why I'm so glad that you are launching this critical project today to provide your Know Your Rights resources and legal referrals to those impacted by racial profiling by our federal government and institutions. Again, I want to thank AAJC for the launch of this crucial initiative, and I look forward to our continued work together to address racial profiling and safeguard the civil rights of all Americans.
Thank you very much, Representative Chu. And again, thank you so much for your leadership. Definitely have, among other things, appreciated you bring us into some of these meetings with other members of the intelligence community, members of Congress, as both on the House side as well as the Senate side, to engage in these discussions. It's been very important. It's been very productive. So let me tell everyone a little bit about this project that we are launching, and again, a little bit of the history behind this project. As Representative Chu said, one of the things that we have been seeing over the last several years, and to be clear, it is not just within the context of the Trump administration, although that has certainly exacerbated it, that there has been an increased targeting of Chinese American scientists and academics and researchers of all types on these charges of espionage, commercial espionage, and trade secret theft. Now, one thing to be clear is that the Communist Party of China is doing some really terrible things in the United States and does present real national security threats. And certainly the Chinese government is no friend when it comes to civil rights issues that organizations like ours care about, whether it is with respect to Muslims and Uyghurs in Xinjiang, whether it is freedom of the press in Hong Kong, or the overall surveillance state in the mainland China. But at the same time, we can't let those aspects mask those aspects of the Chinese government mask what is happening here in the United States, and with respect to making all Chinese Americans here suspects in this diplomatic issue that we have between the Chinese government. You know, the reality is that there are many in the United States that are being targeted with criminal wrongdoing and espionage, and are part of this process where they've been ensnared by overzealous prosecutors based on racial bias, based on generalizations against the Chinese and Asian American community. And you know, the unfortunate thing is this is a history that we've seen before in the past, whether it is with respect to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 that excluded Chinese from the United States, even after Chinese helped to build the transcontinental railroad in the late 1860s, whether it is in World War II with the incarceration of Japanese Americans on so-called suspicions of disloyalty to the United States, or whether it was in the aftermath of 9/11, where Arabs, Middle Eastern, Muslims, South Asian Americans were targeted and faced violence because of this alleged threat of terrorism that we all had. And so the Asian American community has seen this before. It's always this notion of either us being a model minority or us being the yellow peril. And in fact, in this particular case, it is a situation that we are facing both of these stereotypes. This one stereotype of being a model minority that is excelling in STEM, that is contributing to the science community, and that somehow, because of sort of what our community is doing, that we are being used as a wedge against other communities of color. But then we are also seen as that foreigner that cannot be trusted. And so it is in this context that we built this project. And this project is aimed to protect the Chinese American community in particular, but the broader Asian American community with respect to academics, with respect to research. So there's three pillars to the work that we're trying to do with this project. The first pillar is education. It's to educate our community members about their rights as Americans, about their due process rights, and to educate universities and law enforcement agencies about that bias and profiling, and to make sure that we are all being smart in what we do. The second pillar is advocacy. As Representative Judy Chu said, there are a lot of government policies that we are looking at, whether it is legislation, whether it is executive actions, that contribute to this atmosphere in which we are facing. And it's important for us to talk to these law enforcement officials, whether it is at DOJ or FBI, to make sure we have legislation that, again, protects civil rights while also combating some of the real diplomatic issues that we have. And then third is with respect to legal referrals. Once our community knows their rights, and we encourage them to make sure that they do know their rights, oftentimes there will be a need for a lawyer. And one of the gaps in the community traditionally has been to find the right lawyer for these types of cases. Because unfortunately, these are not garden variety types of cases, and that the need for a specialized lawyer is important. So for us, it is about building this project out and making sure that we have these resources that could really play to our community. So to speak to some of these particular issues and really to give firsthand accounts of what is going on, I'm proud and privileged to bring Professor Xiaoxing Xi, who, as I said, is a professor at Temple University and was one of those community members who was wrongfully accused of espionage by our federal government. We are very grateful to have him here to share his own perspective on how this has impacted his career and his personal life. Professor Xi.
Thank you, John. As John said, that I am a physics professor at Temple University. 5 years ago, I was charged by the US government for sharing US company technology with Chinese government entity. The charges were totally false, and the government dropped the charges almost 4 months later. However, significant damages were done to my career and the well-being of my family. From my own personal experience, I can say that the anti-racial profiling project of the Asian American Advancing Justice AAJC is an important and timely initiative that will be an extremely valuable service to the Asian American community. First, we need to stop the government officials treating Chinese scientists, academics, and students as non-traditional collectors or spies for China, which caused the false prosecutions of myself, Sherry Chen, and many other Chinese scientists. For me, the experience was very traumatizing. In one early morning, I was woken up by loud knocks on my door and found FBI agents outside my house who put handcuffs on me on the spot. I watched armed agents in bulletproof vests bursting into my house, shouting FBI, FBI, and running up my wife and 2 daughters at gunpoint. My younger daughter was only 12 years old at that time. When I was taken away from my house, I had no idea why I was arrested and when I would see my family again. This happened without any warning. One day I was a respected researcher and department chair. Overnight, I was painted as a Chinese spy all over the news and the internet and faced the possibility of up to 80 years in prison and a $1 million fine. I could not appear on campus, could not talk to my students, and I was no longer the principal investigator of my research grants. During the 4 months I fought the false charges, there were many moments of frustrations and despair. The cumulative stress was so extreme that it has left permanent marks in our mental and physical health that we are still experiencing today. We are now living under constant concern that the government is still reading my emails and listening to my phone calls, and anything I do could be twisted as a reason to charge me. The harm to anyone being falsely charged is immense, and we have to stop it from happening again to any innocent people. Similarly, we need to stop the policy of using the heavy hammer of criminal law on Chinese scientists and professors when there are non-criminal alternatives for the alleged offenses. The punishment should fit the offenses and are not discriminatory. The current prosecution of many Chinese professors have made doing research while Chinese truly scary. Second, for anyone who is caught in the crosshairs of the government, legal advices and referrals are badly needed. When I was arrested, I faced two daunting tasks: finding the right lawyer for my defense and figuring out how to pay for their services. Like most scientists, I had no idea how to do either of them, while knowing that my whole life depended on my doing them right. To this day, I am grateful to a lawyer who came to my house and kind of gave me a tutorial on how to build my defense team. It was like bringing me charcoal in the middle of a snowstorm. Comparing to the limitless resources of the federal government, we the individuals are at a significant disadvantage in the legal system. Often people hesitate to help those who are accused. In the current atmosphere, when the US-China tension is escalating by the day, and Chinese scientists, professors, and the students are considered suspected Chinese spies, the legal advices and the referrals provided by the Anti-Racial Profiling Project will go a long way in making sure that justice is done in every case. So I commend you for establishing the Anti-Racial Profiling Project, and I'm happy to help whenever there is opportunity. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shi. And again, certainly we feel it's very unfortunate that you had to go through that, the situation that you went through, the prosecution that you went through. But we take inspiration from the way in which you fought for justice, and certainly sort of use that as a guiding star for what we are trying to accomplish with this project. Thank you. For the next speaker, we have Professor Frank Wu. Professor Wu is now the president of Queens College. He is one of the people that had this idea behind creating this project to help protect Asian American scientists and professors. So Professor Wu.
Thank you so much, John. It's always good to work with AAJC, a real leader in this area, and John himself has just done so much, so I really want to lift that up. I'm going to make 3 points. Law professors always make 3 points when they speak. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening out there. Second, some of the arguments that you'll hear back and forth that are frustrating, but that we have to respond to. And third, the calls that I started to get a few years ago that I never got before, and how we realized, not just me, but many of us, that there was such a need for this. Let me start very briefly. You know, there are real cases. I always say that. There are people who are up to no good. And sometimes they're spies. Sometimes they're not spies. They're just greedy and they're crossing the line. Sometimes they failed to disclose conflicts of interest, or they haven't paid their taxes. That's not right. I'm not condoning that. But in many of these instances, when you look at the cases, they're not actually engaged in espionage, meaning spying on behalf of a foreign government. They're just people who have done something wrong, and they should be prosecuted and punished, but that doesn't mean that the next person who happens to look like them also has done something wrong. And we have to be mindful that in addition to people like Dr. Shi, the false positives, a term that we've learned with all the pandemic, people who we think have done something, but they didn't. It's false, it's fake news. In addition to those cases, We have changing standards and double standards. People who are engaged in activity that was encouraged just a few years ago when every college was looking for a Chinese partner. Who do they turn to? Their ethnic Chinese scientists on their faculty and staff. And double standards, where yes, people have done something wrong, but if they weren't of Chinese descent, someone would have said to them, you need to fill out this form differently, or they might have been scolded, or they might have faced something a little more severe, but as an employment matter, not criminal prosecution with the possibility of going to prison for the rest of your life. So that's the first thing. And I think so many of the speakers, from Congresswoman Chu to John, and probably just about every one of us, want to be clear that we are not trying to protect espionage. Those cases should be prosecuted, the real ones. The problem is separating those real ones from the ones that are false positives. That takes me to the second point. You know, I've had so many conversations now, and sometimes I've been on TV shows talking about this, and someone will say, but look, there's this guilty person over here. Well, so what? When it comes to other people, especially those who are part of the majority, when one person's guilty, that doesn't mean that that person over here, who has nothing in common except for the color of skin, the texture of hair, the shape of eyes, that they're guilty as well, right? It's only when it comes to minorities that we think that there's a pattern, that there's a propensity, that culturally people engage in this type of conduct. And so what's happened is when we point out it's prejudice, people say, no, no, it's true. That's how the Chinese are. Well, that's the definition of prejudice. When you make an assumption about a group and you apply it to all or almost all, and leading government officials have come right out and said it, that it's all or almost all. So they're not looking at individuals. They're trying to excuse their prejudice by saying, yes, but it's true of a small number. I have no doubt that it's true of a small number. That doesn't mean it's true of almost 4 million Chinese Americans, some of whom are adoptees or mixed race or sixth generation, some who don't speak any Chinese dialect, have never been to China. So let me turn to the third and final point, which is the effect. So starting a few years ago, I started to get emails, phone calls from dozens of people. That's no surprise. If you look at the press accounts, there are thousands of cases pending. Investigations by the NIH, NSF, by the FBI, by universities, by employers, thousands of cases. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying everyone doing an investigation is a bigot. No, I'm not saying that. I am pointing out, though, that the consequence, regardless of the intent, maybe it's good intent, it's to protect America. That's something that we want. The consequence is fear among Chinese Americans, including native-born Chinese Americans, naturalized citizens, immigrants, and exchange students, because of this implicit bias that we've all learned so much about, the images rattling around in our head. That's why we need this project. Thank you so much, and thank you, John and AAJC, for doing all you've done to set it up.
Thank you very much, Professor Wu. And Professor Wu brings up several good points. And this also goes to part of what our organization does. Our organization, among other things, is on the front lines of immigration issues, front lines of voting rights, front lines of census. Hopefully everyone has already filled out their census. And it's about making sure that we're all included as Americans. And in this sense, it is no different. Here what we are seeing is that the Asian American community at several times in our history, has been treated as less than Americans simply because of our ethnicity, because of our national origin, because of literally the color of our skin. And so this project aims to address some of these issues in this broader context that we're talking about. Next, I'm delighted to bring Dr. Stephen Pei on as a speaker. Dr. Pei is the founding chair of an organization called United Chinese Americans, which represents a large group of first-generation Chinese immigrants, to talk about the work that they have been doing and how they are partnering with us on this project. Dr. Pei.
Thank you, John. I think even though UCA is primarily the first-generation immigrant organization, I'm from Taiwan. So I didn't know too many of those people working in the medical field. I'm an engineer. But even before February 2018, when FBI Director Wray testified at the Senate, that the Chinese American whole society threat. That even before that, the Asian American community had already been filled with rumors that many researchers were under investigation. After the 14 APA organizations wrote a letter to Director Ray on March 1st, 2018, request a meeting, then we are getting phone calls from the scientists, as what Frank just mentioned. 6 months later, two events made the situation even much worse. In August 2018, FBI held a meeting in Houston with 100 top leaders of Texas academic and the medical institutions behind Coastal in Houston. As far as we know, not a single Chinese American attended the meeting. Also in August 2018, a senior researcher was arrested on allegation of possession of child pornography image. 3 months later, a grand jury declined to indict researchers. However, just like in Xi Xiaoxin's case, the damage has been done. His career was completely ruined. At that time, a number of Asian Pacific American communities tried to approach FBI local offices. In September 2018, Houston held a whole-day educational forum, of which the next speaker, Regina G Caldwell, and I were co-chairs. It was followed by a panel discussion at the UCA National Convention a week later in Washington, D.C. These were the only two forums open to the whole community that FBI attended at that time. Later, at the end of the year, I also joined a handful of representatives and met with FBI at its headquarters in Washington, D.C. So these two events were reported by the Chronicle, and that started to attract the attention of academic, professional organizations, university presidents, and the media. Finally, in April 2019, MD Anderson Cancer Center released some of the information requested by the media, which showed that MD Anderson voluntarily gave 10 years of email of 23 employees to FBI in December 2017. The community was kept in the dark for almost 1.5 years. By that time, a number of the top researchers had already left. Nobody was ever charged for any criminal crime. Most noticeably were the former vice president for basic research at MD Anderson Cancer Center. Dr. Hong is now the president of a prestigious medical university in Taiwan. The other one was a former department chair, Dr. Wu. She is now the dean of the School of Public Health and also the vice president of the affiliate hospital in a prestigious university in China. These are the top-notch researchers. Then the foreign country tried to recruit for over 10 years, but unsuccessfully. Now we help them to accomplish what they could not accomplish by themselves. So I think it's a loss of our country that I've been telling people for since 2018. I think this is really harming the competitiveness of our country. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pei, for your comments and your thoughts. Our final speaker is also a member of the community, and that's Regina G Caldwell, who is based in Houston. As some of you may have seen, the Houston Chinese Consulate closed a little while ago, which caused a great deal of consternation within the Chinese community, because during that time also the FBI was making outreach to the Chinese American community and Chinese community there. So Regina will tell us a little bit about the experience on the ground in Houston. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
If I might before, if you have questions, please start using the chat box to ask questions, and then I will direct the questions to the appropriate speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this illustrious panel and this important announcement. I wanted to share some information about the local impact and experiences in Houston, Texas. We not only have one of the largest Asian American populations in the country, but as you know, we are also the home of the largest medical center, energy capital of the world, space center, and a growing technological and academic community. In the fall of 2018, as Stephen had just mentioned, many of us in the community wanted to saw that we were experiencing cases in the medical center arena. And of course, this was after Dr. Sherry Chen and Dr. Shi was also brought to light their cases. And so we were very concerned, and a group of us advocates, researchers, lawyers, elected officials, academics, came together and created a seminar that we called The Impact of Espionage Investigations on the Asian American Community. We held a day-long panel, and we had esteemed speakers from all over the country representing the legal, security, academic sectors, and we, as Stephen mentioned, were able to get an FBI agent to share their advice and insights. What I discovered that was interesting about this seminar were the people that came. We had a lot of folks that were interested, that signed up to attend. This is before COVID, so we had a face-to-face meeting. But their questions were very, to me, common sense, and they had good questions and were seeking information how they could protect themselves. There's a lot of fear and intimidation in the community, especially from the young researchers and employees in the medical, technological, academic fields. So our panel was of great interest and help to them. Additionally, several of our community leaders and experts collaborated with other national organizations, such as AAJC recently in August in a seminar called Know Your Rights. So this kind of information is so needed and yearned for by many of our young professionals. I want to mention another issue. It's not so much espionage, but in this cloud of and climate of anti-hate sentiment, we have witnessed a lot of anti-hate bias and hate crimes with the coronavirus, the pandemic. So in responding to that, some of us, again, in the community formed what we called Asian American Salute Frontline Heroes. And it had a three-pronged purpose. One was to raise money to help struggling Asian restaurants in our community that were affected. And our Asia town, much like some of the Chinatowns that you all have in your communities, probably started getting affected much earlier than the regular business arena because of this targeting at our community. We raised over $100,000, and we used it to purchase meals from the restaurants, and we gave them to heroes in our frontline, services, anywhere from the healthcare to first responders to transportation, but many of the frontline workers. We also, third purpose was to address the anti-hate, anti-bias sentiment that was coming out. And so we united with other advocacy groups in the community of all ethnic and racial backgrounds and causes, and we bought an ad in the paper to show our unity. This was very effective in showing that we were all addressing hatred and we were against the racial hate. Finally, as many of you know, in July of this year, the summer, our Chinese consulate closed suddenly. It's only one of 6 in the whole country. So, the services it provided are very important and needed, not just to our local community, but to people who need those services all around this part of the country. Now with that gone, it leaves a void. From what I understand, there was never really any specific information or documentation of misdeeds or spying, and the usual things were going on, but it's suspected that most of it was due to politics. I've raised all of this just to say that there is this a climate of anti-Asian bias and hatred. And this resource that AAJC, thanks to them and the other supporters, that will be created and will be used a lot by our whole community, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regine. And again, thank you to all the speakers. If people have questions, by all means, please use the chat box to ask the questions. I do have a couple of questions already. First is to focus on AAJC. The question is, can you speak about what exactly the educational awareness pillar of this project will look like? And with respect to legal support for those who cannot afford legal help, how that will be addressed. With respect to the educational awareness pillar, that focuses in two ways. One is upon our community itself to make sure that our community understands their rights in this process. The fact that simply because the FBI comes to your door, that you do not have to answer questions, that you have a right to a lawyer and to talk to a lawyer first. Oftentimes in these situations, obviously it is intimidating for people and they have a tendency to want to talk, to appear to be cooperative. But it's also important to know that you do not have to do that. And in fact, anytime you talk to an FBI agent or DOJ, the fact that those words can later be used against you, even if you make innocent mistakes. Oftentimes, many of these cases have involved situations where people inadvertently have misstated things, and as a result, they've been dragged further into a legal proceeding. So the one focus is on our community in terms of knowing their rights. The second focus is on policymakers and others within the law enforcement community, as well as within the educational community, to make sure that they understand what is going on and to engage in discussions about racial bias, racial profiling, and to make sure that there is nothing that is happening either explicitly or implicitly that is causing Asian Americans to be targeted in an unfair way. The second is with respect to pro bono efforts or people that cannot afford legal services. And we will admit, this is one that still is going to take additional work because oftentimes these situations involve criminal investigations that can easily drain someone's pocketbook. These can be expensive investigations. And so we do not have an easy answer. Certainly in some cases, attorneys have been able to set up legal defense funds or something along those lines. And certainly that is are things that attorneys, once they get cases, they will explore. But we all also need to look into that further. Let me see. So those are the answers to those two questions. I received a question on how to make a donation to the project. Appreciate that question. I think we could probably put in the chat box a donation box to the project. Obviously, we are a nonprofit organization, and so we appreciate any support. The next question is the service open to all victims in the United States or has to be a scholar? Is there a hotline to call? And so there will be a legal referral number that can be used. And in fact, I would ask people to join our webinar tomorrow. We will talk more about operational details, if you will, of the project. And we will be rolling out that number that people can use. With respect to whether it's in the United States or not, it is focused on the United States with respect to scholars that are here in the United States. But importantly, it's not focused on citizens. We recognize that many of these scholars are not necessarily American citizens, and frankly, that is an issue that we recognize makes this issue even more complex. Is if you are here even as a permanent resident, if you are convicted even of a quote unquote so-called lesser crime, that can affect your pathway to citizenship. And so that's another reason that our community needs to understand these issues even more. Let's see. And I apologize that most of these questions are more directed towards AAJC. And actually, one of these questions I will ask perhaps Professor Wu or Dr. Pei to weigh in on. And the question is, what sort of policy or institutional changes should we be striving towards with law enforcement agencies and universities? Certainly for AAJC, we work quite a bit with the law enforcement, we look to work with the law enforcement agency or members of Congress to develop the appropriate oversight over these types of investigations. But perhaps I could lean on Professor Wu and then Dr. Pei to focus on the academic institutions and what can be done. So Professor Wu.
Sure. So there are some instances where people will just say outright, we heard the FBI director do this, they'll say outright that all or almost all or most people coming from China are engaged in espionage. The FBI has long had a theory of non-traditional collectors with grains of sand. The idea is this isn't James Bond or Jason Bourne. It's people who really are graduate students, visiting scholars. But on the side, they're gathering data. That's the idea of a non-traditional collector. They're sort of amateur spies who are working on a PhD, but then will go back and share with China something that they've taken illicitly. Many have discredited this theory. It's not an accurate picture of how it works. Nonetheless, that's the idea. So some will say that openly, and what we need to do in those cases is to fight back and say, look, that's just not true. It is false. It is fake news. Then there are those who will say, no, we don't profile. There are lots of people, they're savvy, they're sensitive, they know it doesn't look good if you just openly say we're prejudiced. So they'll say, no, we don't look at race. But then when you look at who they're going after, it's overwhelmingly, and there are statistical studies that bear this out, it's overwhelmingly people of Chinese descent, and the rate of acquittal or cases being dropped is much, much higher for people of Chinese descent. So not only are they going after people of Chinese descent disproportionately, they're wrong disproportionately. And let me emphasize, it is not just foreigners. It includes naturalized citizens. It includes native-born citizens who are being denied security clearances, who are not being promoted, includes people working for the US government, includes people in the US military. So in that case, where people say, we wouldn't discriminate, but you look at the pattern, you say, well, if it's not discrimination, something awful funny is going on. Then we need the sort of bias training that we now see with Black Lives Matter is so important that should be extended to people of Asian descent. So it's a two-pronged approach, addressing both the egregious in-your-face form of prejudice and the more subtle and structural form that people would deny.
And Dr. Pei, when I pose this question to you, and actually I will propose it to Professor Shi as well, is what do you see as the impact on the research environment here in the United States with some of the profiling that has been going on, or the investigations that have been going on?
I think there are two parts here. The first part is the incoming flux of students. American universities depend heavily on the students and postdocs and researchers from foreign countries, in particular from China. I think what happened in the past year is clearly there's a drop. The drop for two reasons. One is the people feel intimidated, so they stop applying to come to the US. On the other hand, even students they were approved to come this year, they were not able to, accepted by university, but they had hard time to get visa to come. So on one hand, we got impact on the research talent, then the science and technology in this country leads so badly. On the other hand, American university depends so much on the foreign students. They are paying the full tuition. I think that is going to make tremendous financial impact on the bottom line of many universities in this country. We're going to see that more and more in the coming years.
Thank you. Professor Shi?
Yeah, well, I want to say that the impact on the academic community is very bad. And I see a lot of people stopping their collaboration with Chinese colleagues. And but I think the notion that the Chinese professors collaborating with people in China are stealing taxpayer-funded research is a false narrative. And because people should understand, most of our professors do not do secret and sensitive research. And what we're doing is fundamental research. And fundamental, federally funded fundamental research is open according to our national policy. So recently the director of the NIH said on the interview that most of what we do in science, we publish it. You don't have to steal it. And so saying that the people collaborating with Chinese colleagues are stealing U.S. taxpayer-funded research is false statement. And so unfortunately, the current wave of prosecutions for people who do this created an environment that people stop doing interacting with scientists from China. And this is extremely damaging to American competitiveness in science and technology because people should understand universities are not industry, are not national labs. And as a matter of fact, the ecosystem in the United States, which created the technological revolution after World War II, is because of the partnership between universities and industry and the government. And the universities is where you do fundamental research, and it's open and it's free, exchange of ideas, stimulating environment that leads to the discoveries, which precedes the preparatory research you do in industry and the classified research you do in weapon labs. So if you get rid of the free research at the universities and make them all, like industry labs or like weapon labs, then you kill off the innovation that one part of this ecosystem. So the damage is very bad. And of course, this is in addition to what Dr. Page just said, that if you cut off the students who are actually the people who create all these secrets, and then you will damage American science and technology in long time to come.
Yeah, let me also add, I think the last December, National Science Foundation released the report they commissioned the Jason group to study for National Science Foundation. I think Jason group was founded during the Cold War days. They were the think tank for the Defense Department. They are heavily involved in all the classified research, but their recommendation to National Science Foundation was very clear. There were procedures implemented there that had been taking care of the concern of all those classified research already. And they make it very clear, some of the cautions we're applying now does not apply to basic research. In addition, one of the 5 US attorneys appointed to be in charge of the China initiative, the one in charge of the Boston area, he made it clear this year, early this year, that to participate in the Southern Talent Program is not a crime. So they admit that's not a crime per se, is fine. Now I think we need to clearly draw the line between criminal activity and poor paperwork. I think we cannot use criminal process to process people just did not fill up the conflict of interest form correctly, even though they have not hiding their relationship.
Right. Thanks, Dr. Pei. And I think that goes to one of the other questions that was asked, which is statistics regarding the number of people charged and the like. And this goes to what Professor Wu was saying, is that unfortunately, we do not have accurate statistics. If Professor Wu suggests that there are thousands of cases, which may very well be true. The problem right now is there are a couple of different ways you can look at these cases. One is by looking at what are cases that are actually charged on the Economic Espionage Act. And those number of cases, you could whittle that down to the number that involve Chinese or Chinese Americans, which may number around 200 or so. But then you have cases that are brought under what Dr. Pei just described as the China Initiative, which is an initiative initiated by DOJ. Now, those cases don't necessarily fall under any specific one criminal indictment charge, one criminal code. And so what you would have to do is understand by looking at DOJ's website as to what they are calling under the China Initiative. And then there are cases that may not fall into either of those categories, but that are cases clearly that involve this similar fact pattern that we have. So for example, there's a case in Kansas that involves Professor Tao that is one of these cases that Dr. Pei describes as a failure to disclose case that is clearly not economic espionage, but clearly falls under the fact pattern. So that's another ask that we have, and one thing that certainly advocates and the community should be continuing to look at is greater transparency as to who is being charged, why are they being charged, and the ultimate disposition. Because obviously, unfortunately, in many ways, any investigation can be opened up, doesn't have to be made public, many times for good reasons as to why an investigation should not be made public. But the downside to that is that the community does not have insight into how prevalent the problem is and how deep the problem might be with respect to the profiling and bias issues that we are talking about. And I see that Professor Shi has given a link to everyone on a talk that he gave at the University of Michigan, so that's great. Okay. I don't see any other questions that are here right now. One of the things that I would suggest is, and it was put in the link, for people that are interested, like I said, we have a webinar tomorrow that will get into more of the details about how this project will work, especially for the community advocates that are on this call. And certainly if people are interested in more information about this project or this issue generally, please feel free to reach out to us. We could also put you in touch with any of the speakers that are on this webinar this afternoon. Let me give one more look for questions. And if we have no further questions, certainly we greatly appreciate everyone's interest that registered for this, that has watched this. This will be recorded, so we are certainly going to probably be able to provide this to everyone at a certain point. But please do stay involved in this project. Please do watch out for news about it, because certainly it is something that is meant to help the community address a problem that we see. Again, as all the speakers said, there are legitimate foreign policy issues at stake. But as we sometimes say, you should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We should be able to address these foreign intelligence threats that are being presented, but at the same time protecting the due process and the civil rights of Asian Americans so that our country can benefit from their knowledge, from their expertise in building this to become a better country. So thank you all very much for participating this afternoon. Good afternoon. Take care.